wooden pattern that I've made out of some MDF. You can see there. Regular MDF. And using some Sino super glue. Made all the bits and pieces. Put some spray putty on there, some spray filler. Put a black guide coat on there. And now I'm going to rub this down. This is going to be the Kitfox header tank. So I've copied the tank. The idea is it'll be made out of fiberglass. So I'm going to make a mould so I do a nice job. And then this flange will be what I can use to mount it to the frame. And on the back of that, it'll be an open. When it comes out of the mould, it'll be the back will be open. Of course, then just a flat panel of fiberglass will go on to seal it off. But prior to putting the panel on, the intention is to glue all the bond all the fittings in place, knurled fittings. So I'll show you how I do that later. It's a similar system to how you put the fittings into a Kitfox fiberglass fuel tank. Anyway, so the objective now is I'm going to rub this down, get it nice and smooth, and prepare to take a mould off it. Alright, so we've done a little bit more work on this pattern. This is a pattern made out of MDF and some spray filler, just some cheap spray filler. Seal the wood, give it a rub down. As you can see, it's quite smooth. It's not perfect, but it's good enough for this job. This is going to be the header tank for the, it sits behind the seat on a Kitfox. So I'm restoring an aircraft here, a Kitfox 4, and it had some crummy header tank made out of aluminium pipe and a tube, and it wasn't particularly impressive. So this is more in keeping with the traditional Kitfox header tank. So I measured one up and made this out of MDF, 3mm MDF, super glued it all together with Sino acrylate and filled it. Anyway, so it's been rubbed down. It's pretty much ready to mould. Now you could take a mould off this in one hit. You could, but there's not that much relief on the sides, and it'll stick up. It'll get stuck in there for sure. It'll be difficult. So, for a little bit of extra work, what I did was I'm going to put a fence down the middle. I'm going to put a fence down the middle here, and so what I did was I used some bits of scrap MDF and glued them together and pieced it around here like that. See, so that's basically a gauge. All glued together, the back there, see? And once you've got that glued together, you can then make the real one. So this is the real fence, and the idea of this is this will sit right on the center line. This will sit right on the center line of the pattern. This will be mold released, waxed, so the fence can't stick to it, but it will stick to it just enough to do the job. And then I'll fill the tiny little gap there. There'll be Bondo in there, and I'll trim it off. You'll see later. The idea is then I'll make this mould in two halves. So then what I'll do is I'll put my mould release, and then this fence will be in place, and then I'll put my gel coats and layups and all that, and then this fence will get knocked away. These dowels will stay in the mould half, the moulded half, which will be now fiberglass. That'll be discarded. That fence will be discarded, and then of course what you'll see is the face of the fiberglass, and you lay up to that. So you're basically encapsulating the pattern inside the two mould halves, and the beauty of that is then I can get the two mould halves off quite easily, because I can separate them on the pattern, as opposed to, and then when I lay up the part, you'll bolt the two flanges together, which will be two mould halves. You'll lay the part up inside the mould, and then once the part's gone hard and it's time to come out, you can split the mould in two. These dowels here, these 5mm dowels here, will be used to reference the mould halves, so that they're perfectly aligned. You might just see a very light line in the mould halves on the part. You just sand that off. That's how you mould. That's how we do all our moulds for wheel pants and cowls and bump cowls, all sorts of things, using fences to make the mould separate off a pattern that may have undercuts. In this instance, it doesn't really have any significant undercuts, but it's still straight and flat-sided enough for me to know from experience that it'll be difficult to pull. So anyway, I'll get to waxing this up and setting this fence in place for to mould the first half of the pattern. Been fully waxed now, 2 coats of wax. This particular wax I've been using, which has been fantastic. I've used many in the past. This one here you wipe on and virtually wipe off. Put a couple of coats on just to be safe. But my strategy with fresh patterns is not to rely solely on wax. I've been bitten many times. Sometimes it'd work perfectly and other times it'd stick up like a bitch. So I researched it a bit further, and on a new part, new pattern, new mould, you should always use a combination of wax and PVA spray release. And if you had to choose one or the other, it'd definitely be the PVA spray release. I find a combination of using wax and PVA gives an excellent release. Wax on its own can give an excellent release, but it can stick up on fresh moulds. So on new moulds and new parts being pulled for the first time, I can assure you, you must use PVA. I have researched it and found that is a fact. And it is recommended by industry that you use a PVA release agent to seal the mould. I guess the problem is the wax doesn't really, sort of wax releases it, but in some instances it doesn't seal the pores and it can dig in, the part can key in, particularly on a fresh surface. So anyway, I've waxed this now, 2 coats, wiped it off. What's unusual about this wax is you can wipe it off straight away. Many waxes won't fit to go sort of hard or dry off and then you buff it off. But in this instance, pretty much wipe on, wipe off, and it works. I don't know why. So anyway, right now the wax is not enough. It's the first stage of release. I'm now going to put a couple of light coats of PVA on this, and then we'll be ready to put the fence in place and start the first half of the mould. So we've got our PVA release agent ready to go. This is the stuff that you spray on top of the wax just as an extra safe measure so the part doesn't stick up or the pattern doesn't stick up in the mould. Respirator, which keep the crap out of my lungs. And then I've just got a cheap Chinese little spray gun that I use for spraying the PVA, and I've got it mixed with about, I don't know, 15-20% water just to thin it out a bit for spraying applications. Now the trick is going to be, I've got this room heated up, I've got a heater in the corner here, and I've got hot air blowing in here, apart from what's coming out of my mouth. And this part here has been warmed up, so when I spray this on, it should tack pretty quickly and set. This is water-based. I don't want to flood this on. I'm going to put it on, build up multiple layers. If I flood it on, it'll tend to separate, and being that there's a little bit of exposed wood, the wax may not have filled the MDF fully, so it could even swell. So I really want this stuff to dry almost as soon as it hits, and I'll build up several coats of this. I'm going to use high pressure and just a small amount of material coming out of the nozzle. So anyway, let's get that done and see how it goes. Sprayed with 3 or 4 very light, very fine misted coats of PVA sprayed out of the gun. That's the blue water-based mold release agent, which is on top of a couple of coats of buffed wax, mold release wax. And that should, from experience, that'll guarantee me a decent release. Now, if you put the mold PVA on, you know, you can get excited. You think, oh, more's better, and I'm fall for the same mistake too. If you overload the PVA, it won't be a problem. It'll just take longer to dry. It may not give you the best surface finish, but and it may even fisheye a little bit on the wax. But ultimately, it'll still do its job. But again, if you can just be disciplined and keep those coats very light so that they flash off quickly, and put multiple coats on, you get a nice finish like that. There's no grain at all, no peel, nothing. So yeah, the light coats to go. Plus I had a gas burner in here, so it was almost drying within a minute, 30 seconds. So a minute or two between coats, lots of coats, maybe 3 or 4 coats, we're good to go. So the next objective now, the next task, is we're going to put this fence on to create the split line of mould. So what I've done is I've got a pencil line there, you might be able to just see it, that's going to indicate where I want this to sit. Now the face that I want to lay up against or start the moulding process against is going to be the face that's going to determine the middle. So if it's 1/4 inch thick, which is an 1/8 inch thick, then you'd offset that. So you want the face of that right on the line, just like that. So what we're going to do is, now this is important, I'm going to put some Bondo on this, some car filler, and I'm going to have a heat gun in my hand or a hairdryer to sort of accelerate the setting process. These dowels are going to be removed, so I've got clean access to the front. What I'm going to do is I'm going to scrape a nice bead of Bondo on that face there, that edge, right on that edge there, all the way around. And then when I'm happy with that, I'm going to very carefully squeeze that down onto the line. And I'm not going to spread it. I'm just going to leave it, because if you start spreading it with your finger, the temptation is to fill it on the back. You're going to have a hell of a time getting all those that flared out Bondo off the pattern. We've got to get that back off once we're done. So what I do is I leave the bead and I let it spooge out as a solid bead, as sort of a lumpy bead. And when you pull it off, it just comes off as one hit. It's easy. Also on the front side, when it beads out, I'm going to have that heat gun, and you're going to see I'm going to get a very sharp knife, and while the Bondo is just going green or malleable, I'm going to trim that on the front face of that. So you're going to have a perfect gap. The Bondo is going to be a filler. It's going to spooge on the dead side, leave it as a bead on the dead side, and on the front side, once it's jelly-like and able to be trimmed with a very sharp knife, we'll trim it to the front face, and we'll get a perfect edge. And then what we'll do is put a little bit of mold release on this, the dowels in place, and then we're ready to mould the first half. Let's see how we go. Leave that nice and fat and beaded. It'll come off a lot cleaner. Don't spread that bead out. See that bead there? Don't spread that out with your finger. It'll pop off a lot easier as a solid mass as it is now. These little bits of wood here I just tacked on with some cyanoacrylate super glue just to act as guides, because I couldn't see the line once the thing was going down. But that's the dead side. That side we don't care about. That'll be cleaned up later. This side here we care about. This has got to have a nice, so you see the Bondo's formed a beautiful seal against the pattern. And so yeah, that'll pop away easily later. So we have the pattern now prepared. I've sprayed a couple of extra coats of PVA, particularly focusing on the new flange, which had no mould release on it previously. There's a bit of wax on it as well, and some of the also just gave this an extra, let some of the overspray go on the part they're about to mould, just for good measure. So from my experience, that's not going to stick up at all. I've got wax, plenty of PVA, sprayed on with multiple coats, and it's good to go. Now, some people might be wondering, or trying to understand what's happening here if you've never made a mould before. This pattern actually replicates the exact part that I'm trying to make in fiberglass. So the pattern is exact. And what we're going to be doing is taking a female mould off this. I'm not flopping fiberglass all over this and then that's the finished product. We're at the moment making the moulds, which are then going to have parts laid up in them that will replicate this pattern perfectly. And that's the concept, that's the idea. So we're using this pattern, which is a replica, an exact replica of the part I'm trying to make. And I'm going to make a female mould off that. And then once that female mould is established, then I'll lay up some fiberglass in that female mould, and then when that part comes out, it'll be lightweight, thin, and it'll mirror the perfect finish, or whatever the pattern brings forward, or whatever the surface and details of the pattern are, right down to the most minute little mark, will all come out in the mould. And that's the beauty of making moulds. Now, it may seem a little bit tedious, but believe me, it's worth it. You get a much more professional finish, a much lighter weight part, and you can make multiple of them if that's your endeavour. But even if you're making a one-off, like in this instance, I'll still make a mould. Doesn't take that long, and the end result is a lot less work in the end. When this part comes out of the mould, when it's ultimately done, it'll be absolutely perfect. There'll be nothing need to do to it. The very quick rub at best. Whereas when people lay up, rough fiberglass over a piece of carved foam, it's a monstrosity. You've got to dig the foam out, it's heavy, you've got to fill it, the outside's terrible finish, as I said, you've got to fill it, sand, and by the time you've done that, it weighs a ton, it's taken a heap more work, and you can't repeat it. If you make a mistake or you have an accident or you get damaged, you can't replace it. Here I can make as many as I want. Now, it's unlikely I'm going to damage a header tank, but even so, it's still a quicker way to do it. And again, when you're making a pattern, you don't have to be particular in how you make it. It can be made out of solid wood, it can be made out of anything. It's going to be discarded once it's done its job. So you don't have to fumble around and finick around. You can just go whatever means you use, whether it be MDF, plywood, Bondo, whatever you do to build it up, you can use and be aggressive with. Not have to worry about being delicate or it being lightweight. It just has to serve its job as a pattern, which is to form the mould. Anyway, with that said, now this mould is ready to go. So I'm going to, the first stage of the layup to make the mould, on this half at least, is going to be a gel coat. And that gel coat is a brushed, like a resin, it's a brushed resin that's got a pigment in it, in this case white. And what you do is you brush that on the surface of the mould, and that actually becomes, later on, that will become the inside surface of the mould. So we brush that on the pattern first. Now it only has to be brushed on, and you might think, oh well, the brush lines are, well, the inside of those underneath, the outside will be rough because of the brush marks, but the inside where the liquid lays will replicate that perfectly, right? And then what we'll do is once that gel coat's been brushed on, we'll let that set properly so it's hard, and then we can build up our layers of fiberglass, in this instance matte, chop strand matte, to build up the thickness of the mould so it's got some rigidity. That's the process.